Good morning, CNHED. Good morning, other guests. I'm really excited to be here today for what is for us a really monumentous moment. For the last 2 years or so, maybe a year and a half to 2 years, we embarked on this body of work that you're going to learn about today. I kind of have two themes for I think what this moment represents, and that one is celebration. You're going to hear from our researchers that TOPA is a law that is working, that is achieving its objectives, that is protecting residents, providing rights to residents, and also preserving affordability. And the other one, which I will save toward the end, is to equip. And I will provide some context for that. To level set and get the webinar going, I want to just highlight again what the key objectives of TOPA are. The key objectives of TOPA are to prevent tenant displacement due to property conversion and sale, preserve affordable rental housing for lower income district residents, boost the formation rate of tenant organizations, strive for a balance between creating home ownership opportunities for lower income tenants, preserving affordable rental housing, and minimizing displacement. Many of us kind of know in more familial terms what TOPA is, but this is a good reminder of what the law was set out to do. About the study. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I do that, and this is really important. One of the things that is one of the learning moments for CNHED and for me personally in this journey is how difficult it is to create data for its first time. And when we decided to do this study, we realized that we had a law that was in place for multiple decades, that no data had been collected. And it made sense to everyone, the council who funded us, the organization, CNHED, that called for it, the researchers who joined in with us, but none of us knew what we were actually getting ourselves into in having to retrieve data from governmental systems that were decades old, from community-based organizations who were actually the custodians of much information that we needed and more. And so I really want to thank the principals who are involved in actually making this happy. They all signed up for a ride. They didn't fully understand. And I'm really proud of what has been collected. So I want to thank Ryan Trout, our chief housing officer, Martha Davis, who was the principal researcher and also the principal at Community Development Solutions, Farrah Fossey, who's the principal at Change for Good Consulting, Catherine Howe, director of the National Center for Smart Growth and associate professor in urban studies at the University of Maryland, our longtime partner, Peter Tadian, who's the senior fellow at the Urban Institute and research director for Urban Greater DC, Elizabeth Burton, who's a research analyst from the from Urban Institute, Hank Brothers with Housing and Community Development, who's a housing community development lawyer, and Joseph Peterson, who's a contributing writer. They really deserve a ton of credit for pulling together data from multiple and difficult sources, and then also really committing to analyze the data so that we would come up with a sound set of findings. So I know that was a lengthy thank you, but it was well deserved. And so about the study, the primary focus of the study is to evaluate the extent to which the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act has fulfilled the TOPA-related purposes of the Rental Housing Conversion and Sales Act, and to provide recommendations for how the district can improve the ability of tenant organizations to successfully exercise their TOPA rights. The study analyzed 937 sales of occupied multifamily properties, 5 or more units, with 37,471 units based on TOPA notices in the 15-year period from 2006 to 2020. It used nearly assembled data on outcomes based on the bottom-up data gathering from organizations, attorneys, and developers, which were then tabulated by the Urban Institute. And so that's the framework of the study. Our thank you to the researchers and I'm going to turn it over to Peter Tadian, who's going to talk about research methodologies and introduce the other presenters who will walk us through the study. Peter?
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. And it was our privilege to be part of this, as you said, groundbreaking study, which I want to highlight uses the most comprehensive data ever assembled on TOPA activity in the District of Columbia. So we're going to spend a little time to talk about the data. I want to add my thanks to my colleague Elizabeth Burton and Donovan Harvey, who did a lot of work on the data piece. But the starting point was data on over 1,400 TOPA notices of sale filed between 2006 and 2020. And working with these notices was no simple matter. The data were published weekly in a variety of formats over a decade and a half. Data entry and other errors were present. So we did extensive cleaning, particularly on property addresses, to make sure the data were as complete as possible. Also, a property might have had multiple notices of sale issued related to a single TOPA event. So an initial step was to remove several hundred duplicate notices that were issued to the same property. This was done by linking addresses to DC property and address databases to make sure that we found all the notices related to the same property. So that left us with about 1,000 notices. Once we had this foundation, these data were then linked to other information to let us examine situations and outcomes for specific properties. And one of the first things we did was match the notice data to property sales records from the DC Office of Tax and Revenue to determine whether a property sale took place after the notice was issued. We found 937 notices, as Steve said, where a subsequent property sale took place. So a next important step was adding property outcomes, and I'm going to turn to my colleague Farah Fossé to explain more about that.
Thank you. Yeah, so we took those 937 sales, TOPA sales, and really compiled detailed information about what actually happened through the sale and through the TOPA process. Our data, our research really focused on, particularly on those sales where tenant associations were involved. So of those sales, 925, a tenant association registered. That kind of started the TOPA process. And so those are the sales that this study is really interested in, what happened when tenant associations exercise their rights through the TOPA process. We know that there's usually a community-based organization involved, particularly for affordable and for low-income buildings. And so the CBOs, particularly Housing Counseling Services and Latino Economic Development Center, scoured their records, went through 15 years. We're looking, pre-e-files, right? So looked at their records, particularly development agreements, the agreements that actually were signed during a sale, and looked at what really happened. When the CBO didn't have complete data, we then went to the attorneys who were involved, development consultants, even the purchaser, and got more complete data. So through that, we were able to get really detailed data on 83% of sales where there was a tenant association registered. So that's over 22,000 units of housing were affected. We only lack data for 71 sales where a tenant association was registered. So I just want to underscore that this data is really comprehensive. It's really good data. It's not just what you can find looking at the public records, which we were able to add to that. Was a CBO involved? Was there an attorney? Did the tenant association assign their rights? What happened with rent control? Was there a landlord petition that would have changed rent control? Were there buyouts? Did tenants take money and leave? That is not publicly recorded. Development agreements, not publicly recorded. Were there renovations or repairs? Anything particularly impacting tenants staying in place and affordable housing preservation. And then this data also allowed us to really clean up some of the publicly available data. So again, very comprehensive. The ones we didn't have tended to be very small buildings or properties that weren't affordable, that really small number. So it's important to understand that this data is not currently tracked publicly. It really had to be painstakingly compiled. And so a big recommendation that we have in this report is that we want this outcome tracking to be done more systematically, to be done in more live time, not 15 years later, and that it has to be a more systematic process going forward. So Peter will now talk about what happened after that kind of detailed data.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Farah. So after the CBOs compiled all that information, the next step was we merged information about federal and local housing assistance programs along with the TOPA notice data, and that included project-based Section 8, low-income housing tax credits, the DC Housing Production Trust Fund, and the DC Preservation Fund. This again was challenging to do because there's no single central repository for all those assistance program data. Over the past 15 years, Urban has been working with CNHED to maintain the DC Preservation Catalog, which compiles data on many of these federal programs. We updated this with information from DEMPET on more recent local subsidies. And so this allowed us to identify whether affordable housing subsidies were in place before, after, or throughout the TOPA process for particular properties. So in addition to all that quantitative data, we collected qualitative data through interviews on 24 individuals representing 14 organizations, including 5 mission-driven developers, 3 for-profit non-mission-driven developers, and 3 legal service providers. The team also conducted 3 focus groups with a total of 21 residents who had gone through a TOPA process. So these residents represented tenant associations that had purchased their building, or those that assigned their rights and preserved affordability, those who were unable to choose a developer, and those who are also in the middle of a TOPA process currently. Finally, we did a comprehensive legislative, regulatory, legal, and policy history of TOPA and its antecedents that was conducted by researchers who reviewed DC legislative, regulatory, and policy documents, as well as court records, media reports, and other pertinent information. And that very thorough review is presented in an appendix to the report. So that's an overview of all the information we gathered for this study. I'm now going to pass to Martha Davis, who will start talking about the findings. Martha?
Thank you, Peter. We just have a couple slides about findings. Before we get into those slides, I just wanted to, I did some, just stepping back to the very big picture in what I learned, even as a practitioner in this field for the last 30 plus years. Some of the kind of insights or striking things from doing this study over the past year or so. Excuse me. So one, of course, we do think this study shows TOPA as a success. And one of the reasons that it's such a large success is a lot of rental building, rental redevelopment, or preservation is involved. I know that some in the public, and myself included at times, viewed TOPA as a tenant purchase program, as in tenant homeownership solely. And over time, really, rental has become a more predominant way TOPA has taken effect. So we enlarged our lens significantly beyond homeownership to include rentals, and that whole process. We'll talk a little more in a second. This study and just the data gathering really highlighted the amazing infrastructure that's built up in this city over the past 20 years, more than 20 years, really. And that how many different legs of the stool there are that really make a TOPA project work. So some of those are technical. CBOs play a really important role, especially in the beginning stages, organizing, educating tenant groups. Attorneys, specialized attorneys play an important role. Developers, of course, and development consultants play an important role. There's a legal history that Hank Brothers research highlighted that has helped bolster the ability to work, because in its early years, it faced a lot of legal challenges. Those mostly were overcome, and tenants' rights have functioned. And of course, financing sources, there's a multitude of financing sources, both public and private, that are really needed. At certain eras of TOPA, the first right to purchase program at DHCD was key. That has ebbed more recently, but a newer program at DHCD, or partially sponsored by DHCD, the Housing Preservation Loan Fund, has come into existence in the last few years, and that has been really essential in the more recent times that we looked at in our study. So the importance of rental in talking about TOPA and the importance of this infrastructure, all of which pieces are needed, are really key findings in our study. I just want to note, in recent years, it's become more difficult to develop affordable housing. And so one of the things highlighted in our study is that financing has become somewhat more difficult. And also particularly the law hasn't effectively prohibited bad actors from misinforming tenant groups about their rights and collecting assignments that we would call premature assignment before full information is needed. So there's some particular newer trends that are kind of threatening the effectiveness of TOPA. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So on to our next slide on the main findings we had. And there are a lot of numbers, I want to say, there are a lot of numbers in this report because this is a complicated process. Affordable housing development and preservation. We've really tried to boil this down to understandable pieces of information. So one is, in this first bullet, that there's a meaningful impact from TOPA. And of course, preserving the affordable housing stock and avoiding displacement are overarching goals of the TOPA law. So the first sub-bullet notes 19,170 units actually were involved with tenants organized and took action to either buy or preserve as rental their building. 95% of those units were rentals, so only 5% was in the homeownership front. So the real story, the big story, is told looking at the rental process. I do want to note another thing that I learned that's really important in the rent. When a rental building stays rental, goes through TOPA, the tenant association almost always negotiates a development agreement, a legal document that outlines what's going to occur in this property in terms of affordability and renovation, and can get very, very detailed in outlining the tenant's specific goals that need to be achieved by the development team. So those development agreements is a really important document, which also not in the public record, but which was used, as Farah noted, in helping us track the outcomes. But it's just part of the system of how TOPA works, is to have a development agreement, a legally binding agreement that's negotiated. A large majority of these units where tenants were involved preserved affordability. There are some TOPA projects where the building's not under rent control and it's perhaps a more middle income group of tenants and tenants register, but we were focused on primarily affordability. And 16,224 units remained affordable through a variety of mechanisms. Farah is going to talk a little more broadly about how the affordability mechanisms work, but that probably, if there's one number to remember from this study, I think it might be 16,224 affordable units preserved by the use of TOPA in this 15-year period. Also, a majority of buildings involved repair or renovation, not always a major renovation, sometimes a moderate renovation, sometimes repairs negotiated with the purchaser, but specific repair program that meets the residents' needs. The unit count there, 14,993. So TOPA provided the framework for tenants to negotiate to get repairs or renovation that they saw as necessary. Also, TOPA, because there's a development agreement or contract, it creates a platform for the tenants to know that they could, for instance, temporarily move out and still feel confident that they would be able to move back in. Without TOPA, it's very difficult to really renovate a building where people are living there. So TOPA has kind of a multifaceted kind of usefulness in a redevelopment. And lastly, there's on this slide, there's 1,055 units of home ownership through tenant-sponsored co-op and condo projects that came through TOPA in this 15-year period. We looked particularly where tenants sponsored it by registering their association and taking action. There were some other condominiums created by developers outside of the TOPA process that we did not really focus on in our count. So let me turn it over to Farah for a little bit more detail on affordability mechanisms.
Thank you. So affordability, often hand in hand with improved housing conditions, is really a primary focus of TOPA negotiations, with many of the properties preserving or adding affordability through a subsidy. And these efforts through TOPA really resulted in a substantial number of affordable rental units and the maintenance also of subsidized properties. So as Martha said, the number that we're looking at is 16,224 affordable units developed or preserved through TOPA. When tenants registered and worked through the TOPA process, affordability that happened, that preservation or addition of affordable housing happened in 70% of the units. So that's huge. 70% of the units were tenant associations were involved, added or preserved affordability. In about half of these, you can see that rent control was the mechanism, and close to the other half, they used LIHTC, often in combination with another subsidy. So, rent control in almost 8,000 units was the primary mechanism that affordable housing was extended. We know that by law, rent control continues right through a sale. But I want to highlight that it's still important because that it's preserved, because we know that often a sale is a mechanism to change the financing or structure of a building. We also know that the sale can open up a process where tenants are encouraged or persuaded or to take a buyout, right? To sign away or to leave a building in exchange for funds. If all of the tenants in a building do that, then rent control goes away, right? When there's a vacant building, we no longer have rent control. And we see this most often happening when there's poor housing conditions. So that's really that link between tenant purchase, being able to say, yes, we want to continue rent control, and we want to improve the housing conditions. We want to make sure that the building at least is up to the housing code. We also saw, particularly in certain years of the study, that landlords would use or would try to use, meaning they would propose petitions that could effectively end rent control. So meaning voluntary agreements or hardship petitions, whereby the rents could be increased far above what rent control would allow. So really having that development agreement that says this building will continue under rent control with these, improvements or without petitions is a very important mechanism. Also, if you look at some of the case studies, we see that sometimes this was done. There were case studies and buildings that we could see had more than one sale. Often an earlier sale, maybe during a year where there weren't subsidies available, would preserve rent control, and in a later sale, they would add a subsidy. So that was tenants who really knew the tenant purchase process and could work through that. So that's this other half of buildings. So 48% of them used low-income housing tax credits to add this affordable housing mechanism. These were often used in combination with trust fund dollars, with DC Housing Finance Agency loans. We have this note. Okay, so this was 55% were new LIHTC, and 45% continued a LIHTC subsidy. So that's a lot of new LIHTC happening through tenant purchase. There's also this note about LIHTC Plus. That's a term that we coined to capture where they were adding LIHTC, but making sure that current tenants were protected under their same rent control limits. We know that sometimes LIHTC allows rent control to be raised above the rent control limit. But what would happen during these negotiations is that tenants would be put into the development contract that for existing residents, rent could only be increased by the amount of rent control, by a rent control limit, or sometimes more than rent control limit, to make sure that nobody was displaced. We know that LIHTC comes also with a lot of renovations, so that's huge. We also know that Section 8 was continued during the tenant purchase process. And I think there's a number here. There were among TOPA 21 projects where Section 8 was continued. We also know that local rent supplement program was added to a number of properties, but that's been a tricky number for us to figure out exactly. But that's essentially a local Section 8 project. And I think there's a nice case study on the use of Section 8 through TOPA with the Wadlock House. So if you want to check that out, that's a good example of TOPA being used to continue a Section 8. And then during this period, 29 new limited equity cooperatives were formed. That's 771 co-op units, and most of those were created using the Housing Production Trust Fund. So the study goes into way more detail on this, but this is a good overview. I think we can go to the next slide. Great. So I'm just going to mention, I think, the first major finding on here, and then Martha will take the rest. So one major finding that we had was around buyouts. I think there's a lot of like urban myths around buyouts that we hear a lot about, tenants being given money to vacate a building during the TOPA process and affordability being lost. What we saw when we actually looked at the data and really got in there is that buyouts of an entire building are very rare. In fact, during this 15-year period, we only saw 406 units where that were part of a complete buyout, building buyout. Again, that's important because that does mean that rent control was lost. What we also saw, so we know that buyouts happen when tenants are paying a low rent and making, renovated or turned over units more valuable. We saw through the qualitative interviews that buyouts were most frequent when there were very poor housing conditions. People wanted to leave, they didn't want to continue. Sometimes they even wanted to leave, because there was such a big renovation needed. And we know that they were most often when there just weren't options for renovations and for continued affordability. There were also some cases, it was a little more frequent to see a partial buyout of a building. And what that meant was just that there's an option. Tenants could choose to stay in place, but tenants could also have the option of moving. And of course, in some cases, people would want that when there were renovations of a building happening. So we saw that in just under 19% of the redevelopments is that there was an option for tenants to take a buyout. And I will send it back to you, Martha, to go over the rest of these.
Great, thanks. So the next bullet I kind of previewed earlier. There's a big support structure that's really required for tenant purchase to work fully. Tenant organizers with the CBOs, technical assistance providers in financial and other fields, specialized attorneys who understand the TOPA law, flexible financing tools. The blue bullet here is kind of looking at the success story over time. And there are many tables in the study, if you can just flip through, that show a whole time series. And almost all of them show an uptick over time of substantial increase. So registrations, if you look at the percent of buildings, excuse me, where tenants registered, it reached 50% in the latter part of our study period. In fact, registrations, if you look at the number of units in the early years of our study period, is only like 800 units per year. And in a more recent 2015 through 2019 period, it was 1,900 units of housing starting their organizing process each year. If you look at assignment, this isn't on the slide, but if you look at assignments of rights, the way the rental redevelopments would occur, those assignments were only 400 to 600 units per year in the early years of our study. In the later years, 2015 to 2019, it was more like 1,800. So the activity tripled per year over time. And that, I think the expertise really has built up over time among all of the TA and development assistance providers. It's been a really a success story if you look at the overtime things. The challenges bullet here, I mean, we don't have enough time in this webinar to talk about all challenges, but there's two that we are highlighting. I mean, one is financing. Particularly, we know a budget season is upcoming. We know the trust fund funding is more limited now, that taxes and financing is more limiting at the moment. So all of those things really impact TOPA success. TOPA is really, one part of the big picture by itself. It doesn't do anything. It needs all of these other supports. The lack of financing is an upcoming challenge, and the bad actors issue, that there are agents, brokers, attorneys, etc., who do speak with tenants, spread misinformation, encourage them to assign their rights before they understand what their rights actually are. So let me see. Okay, timeline. The timeline to sell an occupied building. One of the political issues around, or one of the complaints around TOPA has been that it slows down the real estate sales process, which in general it does. So we were trying to actually quantify that. And with Urban Institute's, large data analysis capacity, we came up with an actual number based on all of these huge number of transactions, 1,000, of 5.3 months. And that the time to sell from the time of a TOPA notice to selling a property, if a tenant association registers, it takes an extra 5 months compared to cases where no tenant association registers. I just want to, I think, make one comment really, that there are horror stories. There have been cases where TOPA has held up a process for a lengthy 2 years or 3 years because of lawsuits, usually, but they're really outliers and anecdotes that are sometimes misused. But this is real data, and in our view, 5 months is a reasonable price to pay, so to speak, for the system to be slowed down by 5 months in order to offer tenants a right to negotiate a permanent future that will help them avoid displacement and stay in their housing. We can go on, I think, to the case studies. So we're not going to review any case studies here. If you flip through the report, there are 16 case studies scattered through the text. The reason we did case studies is we hope that it's a way for people, the mind, to focus on actual examples that are real and illustrate important points. These case studies show that TOPA is working, has worked in all 8 wards. By the way, the ward list, we've actually created list ward by ward that's in the appendix A on page 73. And so it actually really focuses the mind, I think, to see actual addresses. If you go to your neighborhood, you can see successful TOPA projects listed there, and encourage others who you want to educate about TOPA to use that appendix. We also have this list of themes. So we think that a lot of different lessons or illustrations of how TOPA works are included if you look at those themes. Of course, the overarching theme is to avoid displacement. TOPA is for occupied buildings and helps people who are living there at the time to negotiate their future to remain. In particular, there are some great locations that people are not really developing new affordable housing at metro stops generally, but TOPA has resulted in some at the Congress Heights Metro, in Ward 1 on Euclid Street, on Wisconsin Avenue, on Massachusetts Avenue. So location where people want to live is one of the outcomes of the TOPA shows in these case studies. The affordability mechanisms are illustrated in the case studies. And one kind of unique thing that I think is not known is there's a new construction case study, which is on Georgia Avenue, by the Lock 7 Development Group. And it shows that there was a site where tenants organized, tenants negotiated a development agreement, and they allowed that developer to tear down their buildings and build a new, larger building, which they will return to. So there is redevelopment and increased density happening in a number of sites because of TOPA. TOPA allowed an occupied building to go through that process. I think, oh, my screen went blank, but I think I'm turning it back to Steve for talk about recommendations.
Thank you so much, Martha. And I think if we, even though this is a really quick digest, even as I listened, having read the report and heard some of these report outs, I think if you just, even at a quick note, take in what's just been presented, you can see that this is a comprehensive body of work. As I talk about the recommendations, I want to just frame that the recommendations came from the data and the findings, but they also came from focus groups and conversations with practitioners and developers, and they weren't lopsided. The researchers and interviewers talked not only to CNHED members and others in the field, but we also talked with representatives from the DC Buildings Industry Association, from the Developers Roundtable, and the Washington Conservancy. And so the inputs on these recommendations are multi-sector and cross-sector, and I think that's worth noting. So there's 6 recommendations that came out of the findings, the focus groups, and the interviews, and you'll see them on the screen, but they are alignment of DHCD's funding priorities, a reinstatement of the first right purchase program loans, modify scoring criteria in the QAP or Qualified Actions Plan, safeguarding tenants' rights, institute a cooling off period before assignments to address cases of concerns and abuse by bad actors, enhancing transparency with mandatory registration of buyouts, sale prices, and development agreements, improve the housing code enforcement to avoid displacement pressure, expanded access to assistance, increase proactive investment by the district in legal clinics and CBO support to explore legal capacity building initiatives and address disparities in access to resources. And I'll just pause here and say, I really think this increased funding to CBOs is really important. Actually, Chairman Mendelson of the council was in the second building to exercise their TOPA rights. And one of the things he said to me in a casual conversation was that it didn't take them very long because they had been organized as a tenant association working on building improvements and other things prior to TOPA being triggered. And it was just easier for them to understand not only their rights, but the issues. That is an anecdotal example of the importance of increasing CBO support. Recommendation 4 is to address the awareness gap by revise offer of sales to clarify tenant rights, create accessible multi-language website of resources, produce developer directories and buyout calculators. Recommendation 5 is to adopt outcomes-based evaluations, fund a data tracking and analysis regime within DHCD to provide DC with accurate insights on outcomes, enable measurement of TOPA's impact through clear metrics and benchmarks. And then finally, recommendation 6, enhance efficiency and effectiveness with a multi-party task force to assist in the adopting the recommendations of this report, and then facilitate creative problem solving and holistic solutions that transcend traditional approaches. So those are the 6 recommendations. Again, they do largely come from the findings and the data, but they also include input from practitioners, organizers, developers, and financiers that were engaged through the focus groups and interviews. And so now I think that that look at your screen, that is kind of our closing. TOPA is an example of a policy, in fact, law that works. And I think we're going to turn it over to you, Ryan, to facilitate questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Steve, Farah, Peter, and Martha, for sharing all this information with us, with the members. We are going to open it up for Q&A. I see that there are a few questions in the queue. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can all, there we go, we can all be seen on screen. I'm going to pull up the first questions. Let me see here. Okay, so we just have, real quick, I'm going to start. Vic has a question about, will the presentation be available after this panel? Yes, CNHED will send both a recording of the presentation as well as the PowerPoint to everybody who registered for this webinar. So you'll be getting that shortly. Barbara Kraft has a few questions. There's a lot of discussion about the benefits of homeownership, the wealth gap, and let me see, and the relationship of homeownership to wealth. Does the data show that tenants are not interested in ownership, and if so, their reasons?
You want me to take that?
Sure, yeah.
I can start. So I wouldn't say that the data shows that people are not interested. I will say that this is firstly a study of multifamily buildings with 5+ units. So, the offer of sale is going to a group of residents together, which definitely makes ownership complicated, right? So just think about like a typical case of you haven't been thinking about buying and suddenly you get an opportunity to purchase your property with your 20 neighbors for millions of dollars who you may or may not know your neighbors, right? It's a complicated process. It's a big decision. So there's that. There's the fact of affordability. Can people afford it? Can they individually qualify for mortgages, of financing? So we definitely saw limited equity co-ops being created. We saw less during this period than other periods. And I think the reason for that is in the study is just less financing available to limited equity co-ops. Martha could talk more about that. I also just want to note, though, that condo conversion is a separate process from tenant purchase, right? So there are buildings that went through a condo conversion process outside of tenant purchase. Sometimes those two processes interact a lot. So there might be an offer of sale and then the tenants decide to do a condo conversion. And there's definitely a few examples in the study that we saw of particularly middle income buildings, where the tenant association did do one of those tenant sponsored condos that Martha mentioned at the beginning. And generally in those cases, it was a combo of existing tenants getting an insider purchase price, so a really low purchase price for their unit. People coming from the outside getting higher purchase prices, people who didn't want to purchase either staying on under rent control or taking money to move. So answer being, it's complicated. It's really complicated. I wouldn't say that people don't want to purchase. I would say that's a complicated process. It involves financing. We also know that there's huge trade-offs between purchasing a multifamily building and preserving affordability, right? And I would say that in the discussions, like that's probably the biggest thing that would come up, right? Is that people wanted to stay in DC, and that meant preserving their affordable housing. And given the way financing works, that often means preserving it as a rental. I also want to mention that DC does not any longer have single family tenant purchase, which is a way that people were able to purchase the homes that they lived in. Do you want to say anything else on limited equity co-ops, Martha?
Well, just a general footnote. So, I mean, if you're promoting homeownership, occupied apartment buildings is probably not the main route with wealth building. That doesn't really go with the financing, even that is available for occupied apartment buildings to convert to ownership, because usually it is required to be affordable, long-term affordable. So there are other initiatives like the recent Black Homeownership Task Force or program too that the mayor has set up, in the HPAP program. You know, single family and smaller scale condos would be the most practical way to encourage homeownership that leads to wealth building. But again, co-ops, which has been the predominant form TOPA has yielded, do create wealth, but in a different way by creating stable housing, stable costs over a long period of time. Some of us consider that wealth building also. So that's my footnote.
Barbara also asks, well, thank you all for that answer. Barbara also asks if there's been legislation that's been proposed to address areas in the recommendations that aren't simply a matter of increasing the budget. So, Farah, do you want to start, or?
Or Martha, do you want to respond?
Well, we don't have a lot of, we have I think a pending legislative issue about to propose a cooling off period, so that tenant associations are not pressured to assign their rights away if they're not actually informed about what those rights might entitle them to. Ryan, there's no other, there's a recommendation about follow-up, but that's not about task force, but that's not
so
legislative.
I'll dive in. It is all not a matter of increasing the budget. Some of it is a matter of process and requirement. Some of it is a matter, actually, there's one recommendation that talks about essentially creating, for a better way of putting it, a think tank around how to really strengthen not only TOPA, but some other government programs and practices. And we've seen this happen before. There was a rental housing strike force. There was a preservation strike force. There was a Black home ownership strike force. And part of what we're saying is that just given the changing complexities of the market, as well as revenue challenges, that would be good to have a comparable think tank kind of process around TOPA as well, and pull in multiple sectors to help not only strengthen, but maybe solve any problems that are emerging, challenging, not just for residents and developers, nonprofit developers, but for other people in the ecosystem as well.
Just a footnote, that legislation really isn't the major, legislative change isn't the major issue but we thought about in our study. It's really the capacity, the technical capacity and financing capacity to help a tenant group work through a process. So the legislation we have is works for that. It's really, it is funding, and it's technical, the number of housing counselors and developers and attorneys who are available with the right expertise. It's not primarily a legislative issue.
Yeah, and similarly, I'll just add on, like the QAP recommendation, we provide comment on the QAP when it's published. And so making sure that we work with the department prior to its publication to make sure that we can, that the scoring mechanisms really would work for TOPA projects, right? That there isn't a skewing of the scoring toward new construction always, but also toward preservation and toward TOPA deals. So Anna McCorvey asks, were any noticeable differences found based on the number of units in the buildings? So larger properties maybe versus smaller or mid-sized properties?
I think we didn't really look at that very much in the data we looked at, just looking at some of the numbers that we tabulated. I think the 15 plus properties were more likely to have affordability preserved than the smaller ones. But that's we really didn't dive into that too much.
I do think we know anecdotally that because rental is the primary action in responding to TOPA, it should retain rental preservation, that developers certainly prefer to work with larger buildings. And it's just, and that came out in some of the interviews, I'm sure, with the expert interviews and also the tenant interviews. The developers are interested in larger scale properties, and that small one is just not workable financially. So I think that we didn't do the analysis as Peter said, but larger properties probably predominate.
The other thing we've been noting, oh, maybe you were about to say, is just that we have a lot of data here, and this is a living document, right? So there are areas where we can't, we could dig in more, right, and explore some of these questions.
Let me see. Margaret Lenzer asks, is there follow-up research to ensure that TOPA units are actually occupied by low-income tenants? She sees ads for apartments at the Wisconsin Avenue property in Ward 3.
I can mention that DHCD has a monitoring function, a portfolio management division, and there is follow-up once DHCD financing is in place. I think that Wisconsin Avenue 1 may be in a preservation loan. So different programs have different requirements. And one of the initial acquisition programs looks at 50% of the units being affordable rather than 100. And there are different levels of income that are allowed. So it's a multi-pronged answer, but yes, there is. It's not research, but there's follow-up monitoring by DHCD in general.
Another question. In households where there was a fixed income, were additional resources available to assist with securing a mortgage? So I don't think our data looked into that specifically, but can you guys highlight any additional, when tenants do opt to purchase, additional resources that might be available to those tenants?
Well, Farah mentioned what our term LIHTC plus. So if a property is purchased in a redevelopment with a tax credit, and there's a negotiation, it usually includes the fact that rents would not go up for a person. So that's a rental situation. This question seems to imply a purchase situation. And so all the buildings we looked at didn't involve any individual mortgages at all. And we didn't look at kind of market rate purchases. So we don't have a response on that particular one.
Yeah, there's the HPAP program, right, is what would be used for low and moderate income tenants to assist with purchasing. And I'm sure there's people exploring, how that interacts.
So who is responsible for ensuring the implementation of the TOPA law? Are there nonprofit community development corporations identified to implement TOPA law?
Well, I'll jump in at a high level and say, I think everybody's responsible for implementing the law because it is a law. So I think what we have is a rich network of community-based organizations who are monitoring our own preservation network that we co-convene with Peter and the Urban Institute. Takes a first glance at buildings that might be up for transactions. But then we have community-based organizations who are CNHED members who monitor, track, educate, and organize the residents in buildings. And so the responsibility for implementation is, as I said, all of us. It includes DC government, it includes other legal entities, but I would say that the first point of touch actually lies within our community-based organizations. And I don't know if anybody else wants to qualify that more. CDCs in DC are in some ways involved, depending one just on their mission and mandate. Some are more focused on commercial development and residential development. So it really depends on the individual CDC as to whether they might have a touch on TOPA or not. Please, somebody further qualify or add to that.
I've got kind of two related questions. So one is about like what's being done to discourage bad actors and to educate residents about them. And then kind of piggybacking on that last question, on top of like whose responsibility is to enforce TOPA, what can be done when somebody violates the law?
I'll just back up and say, when those offers of sale are given to a property and they're recorded with DHCD, they're actually publicly available. They go to these community-based organizations that have grants from DHCD to do the outreach and education to tenant associations. Probably most of you are familiar with this, but this is really like where that's happening, right? Is making sure that tenants understand their rights, they know how to work through the process, and particularly in affordable buildings, so in buildings that have residents who are under 80% of the area median income, they have support through the entire tenant purchase process and afterwards. And then one of the recommendations, as Martha mentioned in this report, is that there's what we're calling a cooling off period. That means that tenants, what we have been seeing, right, are some bad actors going out to buildings and getting tenants to sign away their rights before they even have that kind of third party unbiased education and information, right, from a party that doesn't actually have a financial stake in the sale. And so, what we know is like buildings are often like for sale long before there's this offer of sale. They're generally being marketed. And so realtors can go out and start that process with tenants before the CBOs may even know. So definitely that upfront education that Steve was talking about is really important. People knowing if somebody comes and is talking to me about, hey, can I give you $2,000 and you can move? I need to call one of these organizations. That's super important. But then it's also, we want to make sure that when there is an offer of sale, the process would work better if people had to have at least that one touch from an organization that doesn't have a financial stake. So I believe that the recommendation is that tenant associations would not be able to sign away their rights before that initial 30-day period, 30 to 45-day period, and that they would have the opportunity to have at least one workshop, right? One education session around the tenant purchase process and all of their rights.
Thank you very much. So there's a question, and I'm assuming this is on the. So it says, can you elaborate more on financial capacity? And I'm thinking that means on the ability to, or the challenges with purchasing a property. I'm thinking, Fernando, if you would like to expand on your question, but can either of you kind of elaborate a little bit more on some of those challenges, those financial challenges that that tenants face?
Well, I can actually just mention, something favorable is that the Housing Preservation Loan Fund was created 4 or 5 years ago, and it involves some helpful underwriting standards that make it more possible for a new tenant association to qualify for an acquisition loan. It's a shorter term tool, but the short term really matters when you're trying to buy the building on a timeline. And that loan fund has funded 26 TOPA projects with almost 2,000 units over the past few years. So, it's one positive tool. Clearly, more subsidy would be beneficial. in a variety of kinds, but this study did not go into a lot of detail on financing and on the follow-up. We were really focused on the TOPA process itself and just getting to the acquisition stage and trying to enlighten people about what's involved in that. So I wouldn't say this study did not get into all the other issues that CNHED does advocate for around financing for affordable housing.
I see. So Venus Little asks, do you strongly encourage tenants to exercise their TOPA rights if their building is being sold? So, and then if so, could you please explain maybe some of the security and benefits that tenants have if they buy their building?
Yes, this is a softball question. Thank you, Venus. So I mean, it's not the study's role to encourage, but it is the study's role to illustrate that this has successfully worked in many cases. And I think the case studies may be the way to accessibly look at those benefits as you talk about of remaining and the affordability and the renovation. And almost all of the case studies are an existing building that remains in place, and those benefits accrue. So you could pick almost any of the case studies if you're to trumpet how using TOPA can benefit tenants. The case studies hopefully are a good resource for that.
Yeah, and I think one of our kind of, section headers or bylines was that TOPA gives tenants a seat at the table, right? So there's a world of possibilities of what can be negotiated or decided through TOPA, but it does mean that tenants are part of that process in deciding what happens to your building.
So I think that this question is interesting because it kind of gets at kind of two sides of it, right? That was the timeline or speed of the process noted as a barrier, right? Because we brought up the 5.3 months because Anna has heard there's not much time for organizing and financing by the tenant groups. So right, there's kind of this duality there. Can you guys talk a little bit about that process? Martha, I think in previous conversations, you and I have talked about just the development timeline in general, in that 5.3 months, kind of where it fits and the challenges that it poses, kind of both maybe to the developer, but then also to the tenants that are trying to organize.
Well, I could start, if I may. So it's not the 5 months per se, but the TOPA timeline, which is outlined in the study in one of the earlier background sections, more or less allows a group using all of its rights to have about 12 months to pull off an entire organizing, education, financing, development plan process. And so people who do this kind of work know 12 months is fast. So I agree with the question that the timeline is tight and it's ambitious to do all of this educating and planning and financing during that timeline. This study didn't look at the possibility of extending that timeline for tenants. It doesn't seem to be really on the table politically, but it is a tight timeline, but this illustrates the success stories we have in this report illustrates, it can be done. It's just,
Yeah, I think we did see, just noting like some of the outcomes, the buildings that had a subsidy added. And this is more qualitative information, but that and it goes along with what Steve said, like building properties where tenants have some experience in organizing or in TOPA often did have those, had a subsidy added or created a co-op, for example. Some of those harder lifts. So I think it shows, that having more time, more organizing capacity, more experience with TOPA does lend to those kind of bigger outcomes or more long-term outcomes. Yeah, but I would say beyond that, there wasn't a lot of study on that.
I just like this timeline question just raises one other point I think is helpful, that The process is a multi-year process. It's like a 5-year, 6-year process that to complete a TOPA project. And so one, it requires a lot of capacity to work with residents over that long period of time. Two, it makes the data job somewhat challenging as Peter and the Urban Institute were looking at things that happen at certain times that there might be a TOPA notice in 1 year, a purchase in the next year, and then a subsidy might appear 4 years later, a closing on a loan. So it's an extended process. The TOPA timeline itself is just step one out of the 12 months out of several steps in a successful project.
And I don't believe our research looked at this, and so it might be more like qualitative or anecdotal from your guys' experience. But do you guys, does research or your experience show that tenant associations remain active after TOPA, or do the majority dissolve, become inactive after the transaction is complete?
I could start just to say, so we did not research that per se, and I don't believe anyone really has, but it's clear that the more active a tenant association remains, the more helpful that is in the long term. And DHCD does fund some of the CBOs to do work to continue to work with tenant associations, to continue to work with co-ops in particular, who actually are the owners. So there's a recognition that long-term support to tenant groups is important, and it's one of the ongoing challenges, I would say. I know there's a question here from Andy Sledeback in the list about noting New York City's co-op track record, and they have a group called UHAB who does ongoing support. So I think it's recognized as a live issue to how to best marshal the resources to support tenants long term after this development process is finished.
Great, thanks for that. So I was going to, with the conversation around co-ops, Brian Franklin points out that in last week's social housing hearing, council member Robert White stated, quote, that cooperatives in DC are a catastrophe. What can, maybe in your opinion, or Steve, what can CNHED and its members do to encourage a more robust conversation among the council about the benefits of co-ops to our ecosystem alongside some of the challenges facing co-ops?
I'll start at a high level. It would be good to find out how informed that comment is, and what's the source of that perception. Challenged is probably a more accurate and less inflammatory word than the phrase a mess. And I think that there are there's some things worth looking into. So if they're challenged, then how do we get here? And if they're valuable going forward, how do we triage their needs in such a way that influences policy and investment? Not just with DC government, but perhaps across sectors. I promise you, in everything I just said, there's some richness in the kind of figuring out of that, like how do we get here and how do we triage and so forth. I think, though, it speaks to a much bigger moment that we're in, which I'll say more in the closing, about how there are financial and, as a result of that, political shifts occurring in our city, and how do we manage those shifts, and how do we create a level of accountability to be informed, particularly if major decisions are being made. And this is by the administration, our legislators, and others. I think that is a moment that we are in, and I think it's in our interest to figure out how do we, in helpful ways, become part of that informing so that people are making accurate, data-driven, best practice kinds of decisions. I don't feel like we're in that moment right now, and we need to figure out how we lead our city leaders, who I think want to get it right. How do we lead them to better positions of decision making?
I would just note CNHED published a study about cooperatives based on real data. And so not that long ago, I forget the year, three years ago. So there is some basis for that constructive dialogue that Steve is talking about. We could get people to actually look at data-driven information.
Kind of sticking with the theme of the social housing hearing, Barbara asks about Councilmember Louis George's social housing legislation, which proposes a bigger role for DC as a rental developer, and how might this role affect TOPA administration in the future, or can't we tell right now? I think kind of the first piece of that, I was at that hearing and spoke with the council. I don't think we can tell right now. That bill, I think, is going to evolve again from its current form. However, the first panel was of tenants and a number of public housing residents talking about their experience in federally owned and DCHA housing, but also their relationship to the housing authority, right, as they're the owner and the landlord, and the need for like tenant empowerment and democratization of like the tenant's ability to have choice. And I think that really ties in strongly with TOPA, right? I think our study, and Farah, you mentioned it, that TOPA really does provide tenants with an opportunity to negotiate their desires, right? And their own futures, and be a part of that decision-making process instead of being sidelined by it. And so I think that in that way, I hear from that social housing legislation a desire to provide tenants with that empowerment that TOPA can help provide. And so I think that there's an opportunity for more dialogue or more education with the council members about the role TOPA already plays in the district and how it might be can benefit all tenants by really being protected and enhanced.
My other thought is there's probably a tie-in with TOPA, the law that DC has, right, as a backstop to TOPA. So if tenants who are in an affordable building did not exercise their tenant purchase, their TOPA rights, that DC would then have this opportunity to exercise TOPA rights, generally conceived as through a development partner, but this is a possible area where, you know, it could coincide with this social housing legislation, I think.
So in the process, we have a kind of a process question here. Will tenants relinquish their rights if they sign a temporary or permanent relocation agreement? Will these same tenants receive first right refusal if the condemned building gets renovated and redeveloped?
So it depends on the relocation agreement, right? So it's important to have a good attorney. It's important to have good technical service providers. So I would say talk to Housing Counseling Services, Latino Economic Development Center, Office of the Tenant Advocate. And the it went off my screen. The second part was about
So, yeah.
Oh, first right of refusal. Yeah, so there is not a first right of refusal after a condemnation. There is a TOPA right for a demolition. But if a building goes through like a DCRA condemnation process, there's not a tenant purchase option. So again, a good reason to be talking to attorneys and organizers.
I think this question points out one of the values of TOPA is it has enabled groups to negotiate in detail those relocation agreements as to exactly how long they'll be gone and get help in paying their rent while they're gone and what size unit will they return to. So having an organized, well-informed tenant group will get you a good relocation agreement. If you're not using TOPA or using any kind of organized negotiation, you might not get a good relocation agreement that allows you any rights to return.
Yeah, and sorry, I'm just looking at how it's worded. Certainly, if you relinquish your rights for a permanent relocation agreement, you don't have rights.
Ron asks, the report, so the report doesn't mention this, but I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on this, particularly as CNHED is kind of wrapping our head around next steps. The report doesn't mention as recommendation the role of DHCD in establishing an individual office to oversee tenant purchases. What about the role of DHCD in the long-term management of TOPA properties or facilitating the management of TOPA properties? You guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mentioned earlier the portfolio management division DHCD does have right now for TOPA or other properties. So they, it's a good check on requiring that you show you have your insurance intact and you have a property manager who's active. So there's a kind of baseline of decent management that's required and monitored by DHCD as of now, that's not focused on TOPA. And then secondly, there are asset management contracts with a couple of CBOs, several CBOs to work with residents on including good management on an ongoing basis. So that's, I guess, a partial answer.
And I'll add in, I think not unfortunately, I'll neutralize that and say I think that there's a more fundamental, I think we find ourselves in a more fundamental moment, which is our leaders, is our political will leaning into strengthening and expanding ways that TOPA supports residents and protects rights, or are we at a point where we're leaning away and looking for ways to reform, if not even repeal? I think that question has to get answered really at a high level about where the political will is around these issues. And then I think the notion of dedicating an office, I think that could only emerge if the political will were indicative of leaning into strengthening and expanding. I mean, I thought when I read it in the chat and I thought, that's an interesting idea. Hadn't heard that before, but I knew that Martha and others would say, well, it's kind of being held in these places right now. So I think the most fundamental thing is addressing this very delicate moment that the district is in terms of decision making around tenant rights, around affordability and diversity in the District of Columbia. And depending on what the answers to those are, I think it can instruct us further around a proposal of that nature.
We only have a few more minutes, and I did want to ask you guys, there's, Martha, you mentioned early on in the presentation, there's a lot of numbers in this report. There's a lot of information. And there's a lot of information that we didn't get to cover in the presentation today. Are there other areas in the report that you might, or that you think might be instructive or might help provide kind of more well-rounded understanding of TOPA that like folks should kind of look to that we didn't get to cover today that you might point people to? And Farah also, and Peter.
I'll briefly mention, I'll gonna say for the second time, Appendix A, so it has good appendixes, I think, this report. Appendix A, again, is a project address by address list organized by ward of places where TOPA has successfully preserved affordable housing. And so I think everybody should take a few minutes to look at Appendix A. I think this was my opportunity to mention there's an appendix about housing cooperatives, which is a particular interest of mine. So while cooperatives are not a large number in the scheme of things in this TOPA report, it's still an important way that some tenants choose to put in a lot of extra work and remain in the district. So there's some historical context about co-ops that's up to date to show the trend over time in one of the appendices. So I'll call that out for you.
I think similarly, looking at those appendices are really important. I want to like put some shine on all the work Hank Brothers did in his regulatory and legal review of TOPA. If you are interested in kind of learning how TOPA evolved to where it is now and how it started, it's a few pages. It is a great read, and encourage folks to look at that in the appendix as well. So I think we just have a few minutes, so I did want to ask Steve. So now that the study is complete and it's published, can you talk about, you've mentioned kind of the political environment shifting a little bit. Can you talk about maybe some next steps and the role CNHED and its members can play in the future?
Thanks so much. What I'm struck by is where we were when we started this. When we started this, we were kind of jubilant. This is great. We've got funding to look into this. This is going to be a roadmap to progress and expansion. And along the way, what we've experienced as a municipality is not only a downturn in revenue, but forecasts that say it's going to stay this way for a while. And what's happening underneath it are two things. Our city leaders are having to, for the first time since I've been working in DC the last 22 years, are really having to struggle, at least in recent times, last 15 years, are really challenged to meet basic human needs. Safety net programs and other things. We all remember the end of the budget cycle last year, scurrying for money for ERAP and other things. We are also, I think, facing something even more unfamiliar than just finding money, and that is how we repurpose downtown, what this new hybrid, if not fully remote work existence looks like, and what are the financial impacts on that. The challenge that I see that has emerged is that non-mission driven developers are seizing this opportunity to suggest that they can save the city, but they have to get what they want. And one of the things they want is what I think we would all agree would be lessening, if not damaging, changes in TOPA. And so what's interesting is that where we started, which was we're going to have information that really, one, quantifies and validates that this law is working, and is also data which could be used as a roadmap for improving and strengthening, is now somewhat being pushed to the side, because I think the fight is going to be much more around human rights. Human rights that are embedded in the law as a fundamental tenement. And I'm disappointed. I thought this work we did, and I want to use this moment to thank all the people on this screen and not on this screen for doing just a heavy lift of data grab for the first time in our several decade history, to now being somewhat reduced to a much more primal fight around what are basic human rights in the district and whether this law as it was created should be preserved. But I do think that that's in part where we are. So I started by saying, sorry, Ryan, I will actually get to answering your question. I started by saying this is a moment of celebration, but it's also an opportunity to equip. So I'm going to give this, and then I will actually answer the question and say what CNHED is doing. I would ask all of you to get the study and equip yourself with an understanding of the basic findings and the recommendations. There's some things that you will naturally gravitate to based on the work you do or the things you know. I say equip yourself with those. And I would urge us that every time we see one of our city leaders, whether it's members of the administration or members of the council or staffs who work for them, is to engage them. They need to feel that there's a community that is alert and aware, not pleased with the leanings that appear to be taking place, and are prepared to, in fact, be vocal but be vocal in a way that is informed, which is what I think this study does for us. Specifically, what CNHED is doing is several things, but one of them is that we have activated a TOPA strategy group. And that group is looking at things that we think are needed to fortify political support for TOPA in the city. And so we are planning to do a council tour of TOPA buildings in February, but I think we got to move quicker. And we that strategy, we're looking at doing an op-ed in the Washington Post and a series of other things. I just think that we need to move quicker than our intended strategy is suggesting we'll move. There have been meetings and conversations and frankly disclosures that there's probably going to be a series of legislative efforts to go after TOPA, and we don't know the timing of them yet. But I say equip yourself with a basic understanding of this study and what it says. Just mantra yourself that TOPA is working and that this information can provide ways for it to work better. And literally, as you engage, encounter city leaders, express your support for TOPA, point to the study as quantifying that it is working. Encourage them to actually use the study as a roadmap for their own decision making. And if you're interested in joining our efforts, contact Ryan and he'll connect you to our TOPA strategy efforts. Again, I want to thank the people on the screen, the researchers who did work beyond imagination. One of my teachable moments in this is be honest with yourself whenever you attempt to get data for the first time on anything. I think we all painfully kind of learned what the excavating feels like and looks like. But I want to thank all of them for getting us to this point, and just stay in touch with us. We do have some fights brewing. Thank you all so very much.